Donald Trump tried to embarrass Mark Carney by kicking him off the Board of Peace. He thought it would humiliate him. He thought it would isolate him. He thought it would teach the rest of the world a lesson about who sets the rules and who follows them. Instead, 8 days later, Mark Carney walked into Davos, Switzerland, stood in front of every major head of state, every CEO, every central banker on the planet, and tore the entire system apart. Not with insults, not with threats, with one of the most carefully constructed political speeches of the 21st century. He didn't mention Trump's name. He didn't have to. He talked about a Czech greengrocer. He talked about a fading order. He talked about middle powers and fortresses and lies. And by the time he was done, the global political class understood something that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. The system Trump claims to dominate is already broken. And Carney just told the world we are no longer pretending it isn't. This is the speech that changed everything, and the political war that followed it. To understand why Davos mattered, you have to understand what happened before Davos. In late 2025, Donald Trump created something he called the Board of Peace. The premise was simple. Any nation that wanted a seat at the table for the new American-led world order could buy one. The reported price? $1 million for a 3-year membership. $1 billion for a permanent seat. This was not metaphorical. It was a literal cash transaction. Pay America. Get access. Don't pay. Stay outside. A handful of favored countries, including Australia, were invited. Canada was initially invited too. Mark Carney was on the list. Around the same time, Trump announced he was withdrawing the United States from 66 international agencies. The reason given, in his own words, was that they were contrary to the interests of the United States. The institutions, the WTO, climate forums, human rights bodies, regulatory groups, were being abandoned wholesale. The message was unmistakable. The rules-based international order, the system the United States had built and led for 80 years, was being replaced by a transactional pay-to-play structure, by a king's court instead of a parliament. For most countries, this was a moment to either pay or stay quiet. Mark Carney did neither. In the weeks leading up to Davos, Carney's government took a decision that would set the entire confrontation in motion. Canada signed a major trade agreement with China. The deal would increase Canadian imports of Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for China easing restrictions on Canadian agricultural exports. The agriculture provisions alone would unlock more than $7 billion in export markets for Canadian farmers, ranchers, fish harvesters, and food workers. Trump's response was immediate. He threatened a 100% tariff on Canada. He accused Ottawa of becoming, in his words, a drop-off port for Chinese goods entering North America. He suggested Canada was siding with America's strategic rival. And then, sometime in the days after the China deal was announced, Carney's invitation to the Board of Peace was withdrawn. The official explanation was vague. The unofficial signal was clear. Canada had crossed a line. Canada would now be punished, isolated, and made an example of. January 20th, 2026 was the opening day of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Carney was scheduled to give the keynote address. He had every reason to back down, to soften his message, to use the kind of careful diplomatic language that allows leaders to disagree with the United States without saying so out loud. He didn't. The speech opened in French, a small but deliberate signal that Canada would speak in its own voice, and then transitioned to English. Carney started with a story about a Czech greengrocer. This was a reference every diplomat in the room recognized it instantly to a famous essay by the Czech dissident playwright Václav Havel. In Havel's parable, a greengrocer puts a sign in his window during the communist era. Workers of the world unite, not because he believes it, but because everyone else does. The sign is a performance, a ritual. The system, Havel argued, doesn't survive because people believe in it. It survives because people are willing to act as if they believe in it. The moment one person stops performing, the moment one greengrocer takes the sign down, the illusion begins to crack. Carney looked at the room and said, in essence, we are the greengrocers. And it is time to take our signs down. Then he made his diagnosis. He said, and these are his words from the official transcript, we live in an era of great power rivalry. He said, the rules-based order is fading. He said, the strong can do what they can, and the weak must suffer what they must. He went further. He admitted something out loud that diplomats are not supposed to admit. He said that the rules-based international order was, in his words, partially false. That the strongest powers had always exempted themselves from the rules when it was convenient. That trade rules had been enforced asymmetrically. That international law had been applied with direct, quote, varied rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. For decades, every Western leader had pretended none of this was true. Carney just said it on the record, in front of the entire global elite. And he was just getting started. The middle act of the speech was the diagnosis of how the system actually works now. Carney described how great powers have, in his words, begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. He didn't say Trump's name. He didn't have to. Every person in that room knew exactly what he was describing. The 25% Canadian tariffs, the 100% threat over the China deal, the Board of Peace pay-to-play structure, the withdrawal from 66 international agencies, the Greenland threats against Denmark, the pressure campaign on European allies. This was not abstract theory. This was a forensic description of the playbook being run against Canada in real time. Then Carney delivered the line that became the headline. He said the middle powers, countries like Canada, Australia, the European nations, Japan, South Korea, had to act together. And he said in a phrase that became instantly famous, "If we're not at the table, we're on the menu." That sentence did three things at once. It named the threat, it rejected isolation, and it put every middle power in the world on notice that there was now an alternative to either submitting to the new American order or facing it alone. The room understood. The room responded. The speech was met with what one analyst at the Lowy Institute called wide praise internationally. Trump's response came the next day. He delivered his own speech at Davos. By multiple accounts, including reporting from Responsible Statecraft and MSNBC, it was, in their words, rambling and incoherent. At one point, he confused Greenland with Iceland. He oscillated between self-congratulation, threats toward Canada, and what reporters described as overtly racist remarks about Somalia. He renewed his demand for the United States to acquire Greenland from Denmark. He bashed NATO. He threatened tariffs on European allies who failed to meet his expectations. If Carney's speech had been a precise, surgical diagnosis of a broken system, Trump's was a confirmation of every claim Carney had made. One observer at Responsible Statecraft put it bluntly, Trump's performance underscored Carney's critique more than it challenged it. But Trump was not done. The next move came not from him personally, but from his Treasury Secretary. In the days following Davos, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent gave an interview in which he made a remarkable claim. According to Mark Carney had, in a private phone call with President Trump, aggressively walked back his Davos statements. Bessent suggested that the public posture had been theater, and that in private, Carney had effectively apologized. If true, this would have undermined the entire speech. It would have shown Carney as a leader who talked tough at podiums but folded in private. It would have given other middle powers reason to question whether his table or menu framework was real or rhetorical. Carney's response was unusually direct. He publicly denied Bessent's account. He stood by his Davos remarks. He made clear in interviews, including with the CBC and Canadian press, that nothing about his position had changed. His office did not issue a carefully hedged no comment. It issued a flat denial. This, too, was significant. Treasury secretaries do not typically claim foreign leaders have walked back their public positions unless they expect to be believed. The fact that Carney went on the record contradicting the U.S. Treasury Secretary, by name, with no diplomatic softening, was itself a continuation of the Davos message. The era of pretending was over. If the U.S. Treasury Secretary lied about a private call, Canada was now willing to say so out loud. Carney was not speaking alone at Davos. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen used her own speech to declare, in her words, that nostalgia will not bring back the old order. She called for a new independent Europe, language that just a few years earlier would have been considered politically impossible coming from Brussels. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever, responding to Trump's Greenland threats, said publicly that, in his words, so many red lines are being crossed that European nations now had to choose between self-respect and continued American partnership. French President Emmanuel Macron echoed Carney's themes in his own remarks, including direct support for increased Chinese investment in Europe, a direct rejection of American demands to decouple from China. In Australia, the response was even more remarkable. Carney did not name Australia in his speech, but Australian commentators across the political spectrum read it as a direct call to rethink Australian dependence on the United States. The conversation published a major analysis arguing that Australia, like Canada, needed to begin diversifying its strategic partnerships. In just over a week, Carney had managed to do what U.S. diplomats had spent decades preventing. He had given the world's middle powers a shared vocabulary, a shared diagnosis, and a shared framework for resisting American economic coercion without breaking openly with American security cooperation. It was, by any honest measure, the most consequential speech given by a Canadian Prime Minister since the 1960s. So what does it mean, in concrete terms, that Carney declared war on the system? It does not mean Canada is breaking from the United States. Carney has been explicit that the U.S.-Canada relationship is foundational. It does not mean abandoning NATO. It does not mean a free trade agreement with China. Carney has explicitly ruled that out. What it means is something more subtle and, in the long run, more significant. It means Canada is hedging. It means Canada is diversifying. It means Canada is building real, contractual relationships with countries the United States has been pressuring it to abandon. The China agriculture deal is one example. The pursuit of trade relationships with India, ASEAN, and the South American Mercosur bloc is another. It means Canada is now openly funding the infrastructure of strategic autonomy. The $1.5 billion tariff support package, the $500 million regional tariff response initiative, the decision to maintain WTO disputes against the U.S. while continuing to negotiate, and it means Canada is no longer willing to perform the rituals of the old order. The greengrocer has taken the sign down, and once one greengrocer does it, others follow. This is what Trump did not anticipate when he kicked Carney off the Board of Peace. He thought he was punishing a single country. What he actually did was give Carney the moral and political license to say in front of the world what every other middle power leader was already privately thinking. You cannot run a transactional empire if your would-be subjects refuse to perform. 8 days. That is how long it took after Trump pulled Carney's invitation from the Board of Peace for the response to land. And the response was not retaliation. It was not a tariff. It was not a tweet. It was a speech. A precise, careful, almost academic speech about a Czech greengrocer and a fading order and the choice every middle power now faces. If you go back and read the full transcript today, and I'd encourage you to, it is publicly available through Global News, you will not find a single insult. You will not find Trump's name. You will not find a threat. What you will find is something rarer in modern political rhetoric, a leader telling the truth on the record about how the world actually works. The reaction has been instructive. The Lowy Institute called it a watershed. Responsible Statecraft called it a rupture. The Conversation called it a wake-up call. Even MSNBC, which raised concerns about whether middle power solidarity could really hold, conceded that Carney had said something that needed to be said. Trump tried to make him kneel. Carney delivered a sermon instead. What happens next depends on whether the other middle powers act on what Carney named, whether the European Union diversifies seriously, whether Australia rethinks its dependence, whether Japan, South Korea, India, and others find ways to share the cost of strategic autonomy, whether the words become structures, but the words have been spoken. The signs are coming down, and the system that depends on everyone pretending it still works just lost its most articulate defender's most articulate critic. If you want to follow what happens next, the USMCA endgame in July, the European response to the Greenland crisis, the building out of middle power coordination, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Real sources, real consequences, real history happening in real time. Thanks for watching.